Hello and welcome to another episode of Transport in Africa, a weekly podcast dedicated to spotlight cutting-edge research, innovation, and ideas shaping transport systems across Africa. I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. In each episode, we sit down with a researcher, practitioner, or change maker who is redefining how mobility works in Africa. In today's episode, we are turning our focus to Abuja, Nigeria, to explore the everyday experiences and urban planning initiatives for low-income women working to work. Joining me is Dr. Daniel Adamu, a lecturer at the Nasarawa State University, Nigeria. We will discuss the everyday practices and lived experiences of women working to work in Abuja and beyond, the policy initiatives put in place to support low-income women who rely on working as their primary mode of transport, and what other African cities can take away from these experiences to make working not only comfortable but also safe and dignifying for women and other vulnerable groups. Hello, Dr. Daniel. Welcome to this show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure meeting you, Chebe. A good one. Thank you. I hope that we'll have a good time together.
Dr. Daniel, before we get into the conversation properly, can you tell us a bit about yourself, your professional background, and the research you are currently working on?
All right. Thank you so much, Chebe. My name is Dr. Daniel Adamu. I'm a researcher with Nasarawa State University, Kefi, a lecturer as well. Currently, I am the principal researcher on the topic that you rightly mentioned about exploring the experiences and urban policy initiatives for low-income women working to work in Abuja and Dodoma, Tanzania. However, today we'll be discussing Abuja as a case. I'm an urban planner. I read urban and regional planning for my bachelor's, and at master's I specialize in urban management, and at my PhD, urban governance. Altogether, my research interest is urban planning, management, and governance.
Doc, for our listeners who are not familiar with the context, can you paint a picture of what a typical daily commute looks like for a low-income woman working to work in Abuja and perhaps in other Nigerian cities?
It is our observation of what is happening in our city, and from the perspective that every human being should have access to consume their city. But however, we have observed that our cities have been organized consciously or subconsciously in a way that certain groups are the ones that benefit from this city. And our planning programs, whether conscious or not, government policies, conscious or not, have strengthened these perspectives or these separationist ideologies. And that's why we want to bring to the notice of policymakers, the notice of citizens, pressure groups, all interested people who believe that the city should be for all. And having read from the works of people like David Harvey and the rest who have worked on the right to the city, people who have worked on spatial justice, it shows clearly that consuming what the city offers should be available to every citizen. So observing Abuja specifically as one of the prime city in Nigeria, the capital city, you'll find out that if you understand the concentric zone theory as one of those key theories in urban planning in terms of the organization of land uses, it believes that the central place of the city is where business activities, the core activities of governance take place. And immediately outside that zone comes the residential zones that ordinarily should be occupied by the low-income people. The essence is that they are the foot soldiers, those who work in the city center, and as such should have shorter commuting distances. However, in African cities, as exemplified by Abuja itself, it shows a reverse case, what the biologists call reverse osmosis, where you have the rich staying closer at the city heart, while the poor are at the city fringes. The implication is that the poor commute long distances to the city where their services are essential. to maintaining the day-to-day life of the city. And we picked out among this low-income group who are women, because we understand again that women are predisposed to peculiar challenges. There are certain hours quite difficult for women to walk, especially when they have to walk long distances. As such, we wanted to beam our searchlight on this. What is their experiences? What are the urban planning policy initiatives that, if there be, in terms of encouraging or perhaps subconsciously discouraging walkability in these cities? And so we want to bring it to the fore.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel. Aside food and shelter, transport is one of the basic necessities that human beings they need in life, given that human activities are distributed across space, causing people to move from one place to another in order to participate in these activities. Therefore, transport becomes an important necessity for human beings. And in most cases, especially for low income people, walking is their primary mode of transport. Therefore, walking should be given attention, especially for low-income women. Doctor, what kind of jobs are these women typically working to, and what parts of the city are they commuting through?
Okay, we observed in the case of Abuja and just like several other cities in Nigeria that these women are largely working within the informal sector of our economy. They offer basic services that residents of the city need, although a few also are in the formal systems.
Can you briefly maybe paint a picture of how the working environment for these women looks like, especially in Abuja and Nigeria at large?
One thing is that when you talk about the working environment, you look at the informal sector, especially when we're talking about within traffic. It shows clearly that they have no designated spot in terms of where to sit, find spaces within walkways and put their umbrellas, patch them there and dispense whatsoever they have to. For those who are involved in selling, different kind of items in traffic jams, they don't have any particular spot. All they do is walk in between vehicles that are waiting for the light. They seize the opportunity as such hold up point to sell their commodities like pure water, like drinks, bottled waters, bottled drinks, and all of that on their heads. These are the kind of services you see they do.
Daniel, can you share with our listeners some of the life experiences or challenges women in Abuja and other cities across Nigeria face while walking to work, especially early in the morning or late at night?
Yes, met one of the women who actually alluded to the fact that because of the long distance between the city fringe like Maraba, Masaka, so what they do is walk from their houses to the bus stop where they take buses interchanging. In between is a combination of trips, walk like 2, 3 kilometers from their houses to the bus stop in the city fringe where they live, take a bus to another station, pick another bus to the next station closer to their destination, and walk the remaining last mile to their place of businesses or jobs. For them, the experiences is such that the night hours are quite horrific times. For women, we also have cases of pickpockets. Again, there are cases that we have established. There are cases of rape. There are cases of bag snatching being taken by bad boys along the streets.
Thank you very much. I think the experiences you shared are experiences that have come up in research repeatedly. Doc, what urban planning or policy initiatives currently exist in Nigeria and Abuja in particular to support pedestrians, particularly women?
Interestingly, I led the team that interviewed the some of the key respondents in the planning department in the Federal Capital Development Authority and also in the Abuja Municipal Management Agency. I also interviewed some of the key players there in terms of what planning policy, what planning initiatives are currently invoked in the city in terms of easing the life of low-income women, low-income men and women also who work in the city. And the answer is such that there is no peculiar planning initiative targeted at women, to be specific. However, the city, based on its development framework, the master plan of the city, have envisioned the capital city as a city that should be walkable, such that they drew my attention to the master plan, showcasing how the city design structure, accommodated pedestrianization as a core value that the city intended to protect. However, the implementation dynamics of the master plan, had led to the disappearing of government and policy drivers' interest and focus on workability of the city to more of a car-centric city. One thing that we also observe is that at the phase one of the city, which was largely implemented through the direct level of the federal government through contractual engagement directly, and the designs were initiated by the federal government agency like the Federal Capital Development Authority. When you go to that part of the city, you see that there is a clear integration of the pedestrian infrastructure, vehicular infrastructure, and even the metro line. It was all conceived, and though the metro line is yet to become much more operational, that there is a reserved space, the right of way is still there. However, through to phase three, at the time the city development got to phase three, there was a change of policy from direct government provision to bringing in market players into the development of the capital city. The introduction of developers now, the market mechanisms in delivering, especially the housing component. When you look at the workability of the city, you must look at the places of residence. And if the places of residence are now being delivered by the private sector, and government is now relinquished to the place of a facilitator, while the private sector becomes the developer. When private sector took up, we saw that market mechanisms became very pronounced. Ideals of the workability of the city was no longer a priority. All the private developers, the estate developers wanted is housing stocks to the market. And as such, within the neighborhood, there was just no investment in pedestrian infrastructure. It was too much car-centric and so much of the housing stock, because all they are interested in is what is the profitability. And as such, we could see that development frameworks that were deployed in terms of implementing the city's master plan also partly influence the nature of policy implementation or plan implementation in the city. When government was leading the development of the capital city, there was much more concentration in terms of this integration of several transport networks. However, when the private sector came into play, we saw that there was a disappearing interest in terms of this pedestrianization or cycling as part of the urban infrastructure to pure car-centric ideology and housing stock supply. For them, it's pure businesses. And as such, in my interaction with the director of public-private partnership and mass housing in the Federal Capital Territory, he also alluded to that fact that they are also concerned. However, it's a national policy initiative that cascaded down at the city level, because the Obasanjo government then adopted the neoliberal strategies that the World Bank initiated as part of the means towards accessing World Bank funding for infrastructure development by bringing in private practices. And as such, it popularizes issues of commercialization, privatization, public-private partnerships. And it was these public-private partnerships, commercialization and privatization of urban services that we can now begin to see how it's shaping the supply of urban infrastructure, and how what should have made the city more integrated, what should have made the city more inclusive, what will have made the city workable and of ease to every level category of income, is now a city delivered on who has what and who who can afford what.
I think this raised the issue of the need for us to reflect critically on how far privatization, especially of some of the services that governments use to provide, have led to the disappearance of some of the basic services that humanity needs, especially a service like, as I said, transport. I think it's one of the basic services that every citizen is entitled to, just like you raised from the beginning. If you were granted audience by city planners and policymakers in Abuja, what will you say to them about making walking safer and more dignified for women and other vulnerable groups?
This is my thought. For me, I still strongly that we need to make this advocacy, to go beyond just city planners, to just go beyond policymakers, that we need a multidisciplinary approach to this issue. Because one of the issues that I also have discovered is that while the plans prepared by the Department of Urban and Regional Planning of the Federal Capital Development Territory oftentimes contain these dynamics of the cars, the cycle tracks, and pedestrian walkways, when it gets to the engineering department, where they are largely, responsible for the implementation, because they transfer plans to ground. As such, it's also another critical point where we see that the intentions of planners for these communities begin to lose, track by the time that there's a transference of tasks and responsibilities, even between professionals within the same agencies. And as such, the prioritization of investment, public investment in terms of what infrastructure gets funding, becomes another challenge. You find out that the road segment, that means the metal portion, not necessarily all the road reserve, gets funded. Meanwhile, the spaces reserved as pedestrian and maybe cycle pathways are unattended to. And so when the government is contracting the construction of the circulation system, it now picks just the metal portion where cars, trucks, and other four legs vehicular or multiple leg vehicular movements take place. However, where these two-legged and are less considered as primary in terms of funding, and as such, you find out that you go to a community that has been designed with cycle tracks, with pedestrian walkways, but what is implemented is the metal portion for cars. The other segments are left as road reserves. And you know the mentality of people. Once developers, individual plot developers, have these extra spaces, it becomes an attraction. They begin to lure themselves into, they want to seize opportunity to add these other spots to their plot. And when you have weak mechanisms of development control, you see that individuals begin to annex these reserve portions into their plots. And as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 neighbors have succeeded in doing that, the rest of the neighborhood key into it. Before you realize what was the space left for cycling and pedestrian walkways disappear completely from the entire neighborhood. Because right from the moment of interpreting the plan for construction, the pedestrian segment was planned for, but not funded. And as such, those vacant lands, for them, there seems it's a buffer that should not exist between their plots and the carriageway. As such, they annex those things as part of their land. And you know how land is premium in major cities. For Abuja, it's a prime city where every square meter is some good dollars to the pocket.
Your observation so far reminds me of the need of us actually understanding how policies are formulated and then translated into the field, especially those linking to workability. We have heard many people reporting of the issue of engineers being the one responsible for tampering or changing what is actually designed or what exists in urban master plans. Doc, as a
Yes.
researcher, what role can you and other researchers, as well as civil society organizations, local communities, play in making working safer and more accessible for women across Africa and beyond?
For us, I think the first thing is what we're already doing was to beam such a searchlight into such areas. And graciously, I want to appreciate Volvo Educational and Research Fund for supporting our research by providing some funds for which we are currently carrying out this study, because research has cost implication. And when there is no funding, you know, it becomes very difficult for people to reel out, confidential data. Like what I'm telling you today is a product of serious research work, and we can confidently, come out with our findings like we are already doing, to say that these are the realities, because we have cross-checked, we have confirmed, we have spoken with the policy actors, we have spoken with those who are affected by these policies, we have spoken with government officials, and as such, researches like this, what we intend to do is not just for publication, because very few people actually still in these days read publications, or go to journals to get information. So what we intend to do is beyond just going for conferences, disseminating a lot of these ideas and these findings, we also want to leverage on the social media. The social media is the point where majority of the global community is consuming its content today. So we intend to find how we are going to disseminate these our research findings, in such a simplified form, but by educating members of the public beyond just Nigeria, but make it a global phenomenon, to say that we've just used Nigeria and Tanzania as little cases within the framework of our research, but these are the issues that I'm sure will resonate with several African countries, in terms of the challenges of low-income earners, as city dwellers, the challenges of women in particular in terms of their peculiarities, as city and urban dwellers.
In one of the episodes on this program, one of my guests said, "It is good to blow your own trumpet." I will say, as researchers, we need to learn how to take our research out of just publication and source other sources where we can disseminate our findings. And as civil society organizations, as well as local communities, players, I think we need to engage with each other, engage with our local authorities, and see how we can deliberate and together design our cities, ensuring that they are more inclusive and more workable for all. Doc, before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share, perhaps about your current project, future priorities, or a final message for our listeners?
Other issues I would love to bring to our knowledge is these dimensions that be explored in terms of land use, transport relationship. It is not the continuous expansion of road networks that will solve this problem. Nigeria's population is one of the fastest growing in Africa. It's the largest population concentration of Black people on the face of the earth. It is projected that Nigeria will double its current size by the year 2050. So do you know the implication? That means that every road that you have, if you do not rethink your development pathway, must be doubled, because the population that will be coming into the city will double. But I have to tell you that we are at a very peculiar part in the global population development. So we must rethink the way we develop our cities. If not, we'll continue to invest in infrastructure that will not solve the problem. What we need, I see strongly, is that how do we bring the larger population into our city centers where we reduce the commuting time, where we reduce the need for vehicles for the purpose of commuting, where we change the dynamics of our commuting to walking. Because when you have more people walking, you have less vehicular need. But once the distance between origin and destination is much more than the average human body can take and become active, people have no choice than to use vehicles. And as such, you are not going to be solving it. It's not going to be sustainable. For me, I feel strongly that as an urban planner, as a researcher within the urban planning and governance field, with interest in infrastructure and transportation planning, is that we must understand that nexus between transport and land use as the point where we need to reset.
Road expansion is not the problem of our cities. We need to reframe how we frame our transport problem by focusing on people, asking ourselves who is better served or not served by the system. And in doing so, we can be able to solve the problems that we are facing with our transport systems. That brings us to the end of this episode of your weekly podcast on transport in Africa. Dr. Daniel Adamu, thank you very much for your sharing your insights on the everyday practices and lived experiences of women working to work in Abuja and beyond. I wish you all the best in your professional journey.
Thank you so much, Ebe. It's been a great pleasure for me, and looking forward to more of these opportunities to share experiences.
This episode will learn something new. Please consider subscribing to our page. You can also contribute by sharing this podcast with friends and colleagues who are interested in transport and mobility issues in Africa. If you are a researcher or practitioner working on transport in Africa and would like to share your work on this platform, feel free to reach out to me at chebechesifu@campus.technion.ac.il and we can discuss how to future your work on this show. Until next time, I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. Thanks for listening and bye-bye.